Hi, everyone. We'll slowly get started with today's webinar. So my name is Ireri Hernandez, and I'm a researcher here at the European Institute on Economics and the Environment, CMCC. And today we have Xaquin Garcia, who's a researcher at the Basque Center for Climate Change, and he will be presenting his work. Title is the Social Climate Fund, Enough to Ensure a Just Transition. And the format will be, he'll present for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll leave the rest of the time for Q&A. So feel free to already put your questions in the chat as he presents, and we'll get to them towards the end. And I'll give first a brief introduction to ADJUST. So ADJUST is a transdisciplinary European initiative aimed at transforming how society understands the distributive impacts of transitioning to climate neutrality. So our goal is to ensure that no one is left behind during the energy transition. And it's a consortium project consisted of 9 EU partners, 2 UK associated partners, and other 11 EU associated partners. And Xaquin is in one of the Basque Center, which is one of the partners. And yeah, without further ado, I'll give the floor now to Xaquin. Thank you, Xaquin, for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Ireri, for the introduction. I'm gonna share my screen first of all. So, thumbs up if it is okay, and share it, no? Okay, so as Ireri said, I'm Xaquin Garcia. I'm a researcher at Basque Center for Climate Change, and I participate in this project at JAS. And in this case, in the research that I'm going to present, I participate, or it's a collaboration with other fellows at BC3. These are the names that you can see there, Manon Sepelde, Luis Rey, and Iñaki Arto. By the way, I think that Eva and Luis, or both, or at least one of them, they will be in the chat. So if during the conversation there is some burning questions that you have for me or for them, maybe they can answer. But although Ireri say at the end of the presentation, we will have 10, 15 minutes or even more to answer the points and the question that you have. So the main topic of the research that we have here is the question that is the title that we have. So we try to see if the Social Climate Fund is enough to offset the ETS2 and ensure a just energy transition. So, but before starting to talk about the ETS2 and Social Climate Fund, I think that it's important to put a little bit of background here. So as probably most of you already know, in the European Union, we have this ambitious target of being carbon neutral in 2050. But if we want to achieve those ambitious targets, it's clear that it's needed to introduce some intermediate objectives. This is here what the European Commission established the Fit for 55, with this 55% reduction objective in 2030. And the Fit for 55 finally is not a policy itself, it's a policy of package. So we can say that it's a policy of policies. And there are several measures that the European Commission is introducing in this policy package. So most of them are important, but in this case here, we will focus in the 2 ones that I mentioned before, which is the ETS2 plus the Social Climate. So, but what is exactly the ETS2? When we say the ETS2, is mainly the intention of the European Commission to extend the emission trading system to sectors that are already not in the ETS, which is the case of the transport and the energy bill and the buildings. So they try to introduce these sectors in the ETS, and as the European Commission already see that there can be some impact on vulnerable consumer because of the implementation of the ETS2, they create at the same time that the ETS2 proposal, the Social Climate Fund proposal, that has the intention to use part of the revenues that will be created through this extension of the ETS2 to compensate vulnerable households. But if we look a little bit deeper on the ETS also to give context for those that are maybe not so familiar, although I think that in this audience, most of you already know what the ETS2, well, the ETS in general works. So the emission trading system, or SIM, is the main tool of the European Commission to reduce, or the European Union to reduce our greenhouse emissions. And right now it's covering like around 40% of the economies. The sectors that is covering is mainly the energy sectors and also some energy and intensive industrial sectors, and also aviation. Although in this case of the aviation, in the last years there has been some exception, but we can say that this is the three key sectors of aggregation of sectors that is already now in the ETS. So it's the sectors that they are paying for the emission that they produce, and they have quite specific targets. So this system has implemented since 2005, and in this year, this sector have reduced its emissions around 41%. So we can say that this instrument has worked in the past at the European level, has achieved that this sector has the correct signals in the market to starting to reduce their emissions. So the intention now is to be more ambitious with this system and have more ambitious emission reductions in the sectors that they are already now in the ETS. That is the sector that I mentioned before. But also now the intention of the European Commission is starting to introduce new sectors in the ETS. And this is the case of the ETS2. When we say the ETS2, as I mentioned before, is the extension of these new sectors that are highlighted there, is the maritime sector, the road transport, and the building sector. This means that now, where the consumer, especially, we will have to start to pay for the emissions that are related with our consumption for fuel, for transport, and for our heating. Although it is true that this new ETS2 or the inclusion of these sectors also will have some price implications in other commodities and in other sectors. But the main idea is that as we will have now to pay more for these energy commodities and for other commodities, the European Commission has seen already that there can be some negative impacts for the low-income households and for vulnerable households. And this is where, as I mentioned before, this is the idea of the Social Climate Fund. That is what, as we see that there can be these implications that also can involve rejection from the public opinion to this kind of carbon taxations. So from the very beginning, the European Commission said, we will establish a fund that will split money between the countries to allow to compensate vulnerable consumers. And this is the idea of the Social Climate Fund. So the Social Climate Fund, in the beginning, it was designed to use around 25% of the revenues of all the ETS from the different member states in a common budget. And this budget will be divided depending on the GDP of the countries and also the inequality and the mission of the countries in different way in the different countries. So we can say that there is some compensation mechanism between wealthier member states with the Social Climate Fund with more low-income member states. So there will be some states that there will be net recipients of the Social Climate Fund. That means that they will receive more money, probably than the money that they are providing to the fund with ETS2, and there will be others that will be net donors. This is, for example, the case of Germany or France, or the net recipients, for example, will be Poland or some other Central and Eastern European member states. And as I mentioned before, the idea with this fund is compensate vulnerable households. So that's the beneficiaries of the policy European Commission in the proposal mentioned. Vulnerable households, vulnerable transport, and also vulnerable micro enterprises. In this case, in the analysis that you will see later, we only focus at the household level. Also because it's quite difficult to say something at a micro enterprise level because there are not so many data. So in this case, our focus is only on vulnerable household and vulnerable transport user. And the budget for this, or the budget that is approved in the proposal of the European Commission for this fund, is the amount that you can see there. Is 65 billion of euros to split between the different member states. And this fund has to be co-financed with some part of the budget that has to be provided by the member states. So, for example, in the case of Spain, if Spain, that is the maximum financial allocation that can receive is 6,800 millions. So Spain, if they want to have all that money, they also have to provide 25% extra. So the total amount that will be available for doing this kind of policies or compensation mechanisms in Spain will be 9,000 million. So this is mainly the idea of the ETS2 and the social climate fund. So our idea here is trying to see which is the impact of the ETS2, and after that see if the social climate fund is enough to compensate households, and especially if it's able to compensate low-income households. So for doing so, we have developed, now is the boring part, is the methodology and the modeling part. So I will not be like very deep in the details of the modeling, but just to let you know here that what we have been done is to use a macro model as William. Later on, I will explain a little bit what is William, to explore which are the price impacts produced by the inclusion of this new sector in DTS. So which are the price impact because of the ETS2 in the different commodities. And with that price impact, we introduce in micro model household data that allow us to say what will happen in terms of distributional implications at the different member states, and what to see what's happened with the poverty, with inequality, what happened with different households, which are the main losers because of this policy, and which characteristics they have. And also, as I mentioned before, one of the key elements of the Social Climate Fund is to compensate transport and energy vulnerable households. And this is something that normally we don't include in our analysis. So in other studies, we're starting to develop indicators to try to identify in our household data which are these energy poor and transport poor households. So in this case, as I will tell you after a couple of slides, we developed some indicators to have this dimension into account in the results that we will provide at the end of the presentation. So in the case of William, as I mentioned, William is the macro model that we use to simulate which will be the price impact on the commodities that the consumer has to pay after the inclusion of the new sectors in DTS or the impact of DTS2. So just to let you know, the main characteristics of Williams are that it's a dynamic econometric multi-regional input-output model. The key point is that it's based on input-output, and that's allow us to have the price impacts on the sectors or the commodities that are directly related with the sectors that will be introduced in DTS2, which means transport and building sectors. But also the input-output environment also allow us to have the price impact in other sectors and in other commodities. So have all the supply chain control and try to see which will be the final price impact in all the different commodities that the household have to pay. So with this price impact that we can calculate with William, after that, we introduce in a macro, what we can call macro simulation model, that in our case is based on the household budget surveys, on the harmonized household budget surveys that we can get from Eurostat. We use the wave of 2015. We use this wave of data because it's the, well, it's not the last one because the last one is 2020, but as you can guess, we trust more on data that are from 2020, from 2015 than data, household data that are from 2020. Because with the pandemic and so on, the consumption of the household will be not so realistic. So we trust more on those data. So it is true that we have done some adjustment of the data to move forward and to be more realistic with the consumption that we can see in 2024. But we can say that this is the key element for us in the microsimulation model, that we have this micro household data that is around 200,000 households, and that's allow us to see what's happened in a very granular level. The good part of our microsimulation model or our microsimulation analysis is that we have not taken into account the behavior of the household. So we can say that what we are seeing in the results that I will provide afterwards is the overnight effect of the policy. This mainly means that, which is the impact if suddenly tomorrow you have to pay more for the commodities that you normally consume. It is true that in some cases, maybe this is not realistic, but in the case of the energy products that are the products that are more affected by the policy, is quite realistic, because when you see the elasticities, the consumption elasticities of and the price elasticities of the energy commodities are quite low. That means that the households in the short terms, they are not allowed to change their consumption patterns to consume less energy. This is mainly because if you need to use your car, probably you have to use your car to go to work, no matter the price. Or if you have to turn on your light in your house, or turn on the heating to keep warm your house, you will still keep it warm, and even if the price is higher. At least it's super higher, but that will be different. So we can say that we have this strong assumption, but even with this assumption or result, we think that can be plausible and at least offer this flavor of what happened at a granular level. And finally, in the case, what is important also in our methodology is, as I mentioned before, the case of the energy poverty and transport poverty dimension. So there are several indicators to explore what have or to identify energy poor households. I will not pass through all of them, because this is a different analysis that we have done also in the Parliament of Ajaz. So it's some of all deliverables. We have this analysis. But here, what we use is the low-income, high-cost indicator for both, for transport poverty and for energy poverty. And the indicator mainly, what it means is that we identify if a household is energy or transport poor if there are two situations that happen to that household. The first one is that you expend or you dedicate a greater proportion, a large proportion of your income or expenditure to energy. So you are above the national median in your country. And at the same time, you are below the poverty threshold. So we can see that in these two cases, you will have these two dimensions. Now, you are a poor household that has to dedicate a large proportion of your expenditure or your income to cover your energy and or transport necessities. So with that, we can also identify in your household data which are the energy poor and transport poor households. Saying this, and to summarize before entering to the results, so we will do this distributional analysis to check first what happened with ETS2 and with the Social Climate Fund, and here some assumption on the scenarios that we will introduce. In the case of the ETS2, we consider two prices in our analysis: a high carbon price and a low carbon price. It is true that there are quite some uncertainty here. The other day I was discussing with other colleague in Adjust about which price will be more realistic. According with the commission, they say that the top price that it will apply in the ETS2 is 45 euros per ton of CO2. It is true that in very, very short terms can be higher, but what they are saying is that even they will increase the allowance if they see that the price will be higher. So we think that 45 euros per ton of CO2 probably, and also looking now the price of the regular ETS, so we can say that probably is the most realistic. But also we want to consider what happened with other price that is a little bit lower to that price, that is this 30 euros per ton of CO2. So we will explore both the 45 and the 30. And in the case of the Social Climate Fund, as I mentioned, the Social Climate Fund is mainly the 25% of the revenues of the ETS, or at least it was the 25% of the revenues that the European Commission calculated. But now the European Commission established a fixed social climate fund. So we use the money that the European Commission in its proposal say that it will be available for the different member states. So we use that money. With that money, we have introduced 3 revenue recycling scenarios that in our case is mainly needed income support. So that's also mean lump sums to the household. So first, we will explore what happened if all the households in the different countries receive the same amount of money, this is just to check which is the real capacity, the capacity of the overall social climate fund to compensate, like all households. And after that, we will starting to focus more in targeted measures. Now, what happens if the countries try to cover the 50% poorest population, or even if they only cover energy and transport poor households, as as it is the recommendation of the European Commission and the proposal of the Commission with the social climate fund. And as you will see, after we will see some results by member states, by income groups, and by some socio-economic characteristics that we always think that is also important to take into account. So before to enter into the results, there are two key driving forces that will explain our analysis that I think that is important to highlight. The first is the output of William, that is the price impact. So here we have these 6 commodities. In our analysis, we have more commodities, but we have selected these commodities because are the commodities that it will have a higher price increment because of the ETS2. And especially, I want to highlight the price impact that we will see in fuel transport. It is true that also in other fuels for heating, as natural gas or liquid fuel or solid fuels, in some countries, there will be some quite high impacts. Sorry, in this case, is for the analysis of the 45 euros per ton of CO2. So here is the highest CO2 price that we consider in our analysis, and this is the price impact that we will have. So, and as you can see, it is true that in other fuels for heating, it will be also important the price that we can see, for example, in natural gas in Croatia, in Bulgaria or in Croatia, or the liquid fuel in Malta is quite high also. But I highlight here the fuel for transport because normally it's a product that most of that is more relevant for the consumption budget and the consumption basket of the households. So you have to think that if you need your car, it's something that if you use your car, for example, for going to work or for commute, it's something that you will need during the 12 years, or you will use during the 12 months of the year, sorry. But in this case, in the case of the heating, it's something that, depending on the weather and the country, you will use only 3-4 months per year. So the impact of that product will be lower. And this is something that is directly correlated with the other key driving force that I want to highlight here. That is the energy consumption structure of the households in the different member states. So in this figure is the energy expenditure in relative terms. That means is the share that you have to dedicate in all your expenditure to these energy products, to transport fuels, solid fuels, and liquid fuels, and natural gas. The 3 right commodities are for heating. And as you can see, transport is quite important in most of the countries for households. So it's the key element here. So that's the reason because I highlight before the price impact that we will have because of the ETS2 in transport or in fuel for transport. And as you can see also here, the countries that will be, well, that's something that we will see later, but the countries that are more related with the consumption of these energy products, or that we can say that these energy products represent a larger proportion of the income of the households, is Central and Eastern European member states. So is Hungary, is Poland, is Czech Republic, for example, some of the countries that where the household has to dedicate a larger proportion of their income to these commodities. And this will have a direct implication on the welfare impacts, which is something that you can see here. So here is the first result that we have for households. So is the welfare implications of only of the ETS2 in the 2 price scenarios that we have, the high and the low, for the different member states. And as you can see, and it's very correlated with the previous figure, is the Central and Eastern European member states, the states that will be more affected by the ETS2. So this impact clearly justified the transfer from Western to Central and Eastern European member states through the Social Climate Fund. which is the design right now of the social climate fund. As I mentioned, there will be some net recipients of the fund, and there will be some net donors. So there are like this compensation mechanism in the social climate fund. So here, what we can see is that it's clear justified this compensation mechanism from the wealthier countries in the European Union to the more low-income countries in the European Union, because the impact of the ETS will be clearly higher in those countries. So, but for us, normally, what is important also is starting to see what happened with the income distributional impacts, no? And here, what we analyze is not the national income distribution. What we analyze here is the European income distribution. So here we are looking at the European level as a whole, as it will be just one single country. So what we can see here is that EU1, it will be the poorest household in the European Union. Probably it will be related with a household in Bulgaria. Bulgaria is normally the member state with the lower incomes. So probably it's more related with that country, this EU1, and EU10 probably is a rich household in Denmark. So this is to give you an idea about which will be the implication, the distributional implication if the European Union will be just a single economy and a single country. And as we can see, and this is very related with the previous figure, where we see that the Central and Eastern European member state will be more affected. And this is translated here in the welfare impacts by income groups at the European level. So we can say that at the European level, the ETS2, it will have some regressive implications. But sometimes, I mean, this is cool. This is important also what you see what happened at the European level, also to justify these transfers from one country to another. But most of the time, the countries are worried about what happened with inequality in their own economies. So here, what we can see is the income distribution, welfare impacts, but in this case, at a national level. So in this case, for example, if you are in Italy, the D1 or the household one, it will be the poorest household in Italy. Yeah, and in D10 will be the richest household in Italy. And this is the average impact at European level in each of these D1 or D10 in each of the countries. So, and as you can see here, the figure is not so regressive as before. So we can see how the impact are not larger in the low-income households and lower in the rich income and in the richer one. So what we can see here is that we have this U-shape. And the reason is because in most of the countries, the middle income classes are more correlated with the consumption on transport for fuel. And as I mentioned before, transport for fuel is in most of the countries one of the key elements to explain the implication of ETS2. So that's the reason, because at the European level, at the national level, it will be the middle income classes that will be more affected by the implementation of the ETS2. And the reason, because it's not so regressive, it's because when we see at the national level what happened with the consumption of the household, what we can see is that there are many low-income households that they don't have a car. Especially, for example, if you live in a big city and if you are a low-income household, probably use public transport, or you don't use a car, or you don't have the car. And that's the reason, because we have this U-shape. And we can say that at national level, the policy will be not so regressive as it is at a European level. So, and as I mentioned, this is quite general in all the countries. So this is what I mentioned before, but in this case, we don't have the size, we have quintiles, but in each of the countries, Q1 or Q5 will be the poorest guy or the richest guy in that country. And as you can see, in general, this U-shape is present in most of the member states. Only in some Western European member states is more regressive. For example, in Belgium or in Austria, it is true that apparently the consumption of transport or at least the products that will be more affected by this policy are more correlated with low-income households. So, saying this, another dimension that for us, or our policy level is starting to be more important is It's always relevant to see what happened at a vertical, with the distribution implications at a vertical level. It means what happened with the low and with the richest, with the low income households and with the rich income households. But it's starting to be more important, starting to check what happened with different socioeconomic characteristics of the households. And even households that they have the same income, but as they have different characteristics, they can have different impacts. So here we're starting to see also what's the importance of other socioeconomic characteristics. So at the European level, and this is general in most of the countries, what we can see is that rural households will be the most affected by the implementation of the ETS2. And also in terms of education, we can see how those households that are where the breadwinner is only primary education also, but that's very correlated also with the income of the households. But in the case of the rurality, it's something that we can see in most of the member states. So those households will be, independent on the income of the household, will be more affected. So even if we will take a look deeper in in the rural dimension, and we split the rural characteristics by income groups, we will see it as always even if you are in the same income groups, rural households will be more affected by the ETS2. So saying this implication of DTS2, we can pass to the social climate fund. And starting to see if the social climate fund is enough to compensate these welfare impacts or not. So the first key results here is as before, is the welfare impacts as member states. So here we can see how clearly these compensation mechanisms that are already established in the social climate fund can alleviate some of the negative impacts in some member states, and especially in those that are more low-income countries, like, for example, Bulgaria or Romania. Bulgaria or Romania, they are both some of the largest net benefits from the social climate fund. That means that there will be some of the member states that they will put less money for this policy, and they will receive more. And that's the reason, because the policy in those cases, the social climate fund, can completely offset the impact of the ETS2. But this is not the case in most of the countries. In most of the cases, as you can see, it can offset some part of the negative implication of the ETS2, but it will not correct the average, like all the implications, which is normal, because we are only using the 25% of the revenues that will be available for the ETS2. So we are only correcting with this, in this case, the 25% in average terms of the welfare impacts of the ETS2. Also, it's important to starting to see, well, but what happened as before, no? If we analyze the European Union as a whole, and we have E1 is again before the poorest household in the European Union, and then is the richest one, which is the implication of the social climate fund. And in this case, we see again that it can clearly correct some of the regressive effect of the policy and make more progressive. And the reason is because if we come back to the previous slide, we can see how the compensation mechanisms is larger in those countries that are more affected by the policy, that are also low-income countries. And that's the reason, because the policy here is still being regressive, but not as regressive as before, and especially in the case of the lowest income households in the European Union. This is probably related with the idea that I mentioned before about Bulgaria, Romania, and other countries that will be clearly benefit by the social climate fund. And then but again, the important thing sometimes is what happened, or the policy debate is not at a European level, sometimes it's at a national level. So what's happening in my country, or what's happening in each of the countries, if we analyze the national income groups or the national results. So in this case, we have, as before, this U-shape for the ETS2, and what we can see is that here again, when we provide this compensation mechanism for all the households, it could clearly turn the policy a little bit more progressive. Normally, this makes sense because, for example, it's not the same depending on the country, the transfer that you can do is different. But for me, for example, it's not the same if you transfer to me 1,000 euros that if you transfer 1,000 euros for, I don't know, for Jeff Bezos, for example, no? It's clear that for him, the impact will be lower than in my cases, especially as a researcher. So this is the idea normally, no? That when you do this transfer, normally are very progressive, and that we can see is also if you're starting to be more targeted with the measures or the compensation mechanisms that you introduce, the policy turns more and more progressive. And this is the idea of the scenario social climate fund D5. So in this case, the transfer, the compensation mechanism is only for the 50 poorest percent of the population. And in that case, it's clearly that the policy started to be more progressive. And even you can see how in the case of the first income decile, mostly offset the implication of the TS2. But as I mentioned from the very beginning, the idea of the social climate fund is not focusing like in all the households or in the 50 poorest percent of the population. The key element of the social climate fund is compensate poor, energy poor, and vulnerable households in terms of transport. So the final analysis that I want to show you here is what happened with this household with ETS2 and what happened when we introduced the social climate fund, especially for them. So what we can see here is that the risk for these households with the ETS2 is higher. So it's clearly that when we only analyze the ETS2 with the highest price that we explore here, the welfare implications for the energy poor households and transport vulnerable households will be clearly larger than for those that are not considered poor in this related with energy. So this means that the idea of introducing this kind of mechanism as the social climate fund is in the correct way, because ETS2 will be more affected. It will affect more these categories of households. And that we can see is that when we introduce the policy, as I mentioned before, the idea of the social climate fund is not compensate all the households. It's not compensate even the 50 poorest percent of the population. So if we target the policy in a way, or this compensation mechanism, or we introduce subsidies to substitute your car or to substitute your heating pumps in a correct way that goes directly only to the poor household, to the vulnerable household that we identify, the policy will for sure be able to even more than compensate the welfare losses from the ETS2, and even can produce benefits, welfare benefits for these households. This is because these households are not so many. We are talking about very vulnerable households, at least the household that we identified. I think that they are depending on if you are energy poor and transport vulnerable, and depending on the countries, around 6-8% of the household population. So it's clear that you have like all this amount of money, this 65 billions of euros, only to compensate around 8-10% of the European population. So it's clear that that money is enough to compensate those households. But there is the risk that sometimes the policies that the government introduced, they are not so efficient to go directly target to these households. So if we go in the direction of, for example, not even the transfer to all the households, if the governments go in the direction to start to introduce some measures that are not clearly targeted to the poor, to the very poor households, and they go to the 50 poorest percent of the population, we can see how the risk here is that the social climate fund will be not enough to compensate vulnerable households. So if the main idea here is if it's part of the budget that is available with the social climate fund, is not 100% sure that they go to the poor household and the vulnerable households, we will be not able to compensate them. And this is because it's so important that the design of the policies that will be implemented with the money of the social climate fund, if they want to compensate vulnerable households, the governments and the member states, they have to be 100% sure that it goes in that direction. And this is very related with the takeaways and the main conclusions that I want to provide you here. First, it's clear that the impact of the ETS2 can have some regressive impacts, especially at a European level. So it's clear that some member states that are also member states that with lower GDPs and lower average income rates, it's clear that they will be more affected by DTS2. So we can say that at the European level, we will have this regressive effect. It's not so clear at a national level, as I mentioned before. At a national level, even can be proportional, we can see, or slightly regressive, but it's clear that this risk, at least between the member states, is clear. And that's the reason because the social climate fund and the compensation mechanism that is already established in the social climate fund is a good idea to make the policy more progressive at a European level, but also in this case at a national level, because you can compensate low-income households. But as I mentioned before, there is always the risk that if the revenues doesn't go directly to the poor households, we will be not able to compensate them. And even if the policy wants to be like larger and also thinking on the public rejection of the policy and to be more inclusive and also go to the middle income classes that as we have seen, they will be more affected in general at a national level in the different member states, and the policies go in the direction to try to also compensate them. What we can say is that this 25% will be not enough. It will be enough to compensate very vulnerable households, but if the government is starting to think to do some policies that they will include more households, or they will at least include middle income classes in the program and the aid and subsidy programs that they implement through this fund, this money will be not enough to compensate them. And I think that this is pretty much the ideas that I want to share with you today. So thank you so much. And now it's your turn. So if you have any question, please go ahead. I don't know if I'm here alone. There you are.
Thank you very much, Xaquin, for the very interesting analysis and also very important set of results and takeaways. Yes, I will. We can now open it up for Q&A. Feel free to write in the chat. I also feel free to raise your hand. I think maybe I can. You can mute yourself. If not, yeah, type anything in the chat or feel free to jump in. We'll give it a couple of minutes for people to.
Or maybe everything is super clear, or
yes,
maybe
everything was super clear.
Or now it's 4 p.m., so maybe they are taking a nap. I was talking to in 40 minutes, so I completely understand that also. Don't worry.
Yes, no. Meanwhile, yeah, I can ask you some questions. I found the results, particularly by other characteristics such as gender, rural, urban status, age, and education, particularly interesting. And I know you said that this rural urban component is particularly important as transportation fuels will be the most impacted. And I was wondering if you have also some more practical implications on how countries should can actually target this in their compensation plans, and how to incorporate it into the social climate plans which countries have to develop.
Yeah.
Because I guess measuring income may be easier, but potentially, like, should they be targeting like transportation sector, like to make public transportation sector more efficient, or how can governments actually are there any examples from countries that have done it, or yeah, can you like give us some your insights on this?
This is a very relevant point because, well, first, as you mentioned, I mean, rural households will be more affected, especially because, I mean, when you live in a rural area, you need more car to move and to cover like your necessities, your day-per-day necessities, to grocery, to go to your work, and so on, so on. The services that you have, normally you need the car if you live in a rural area. That's the reason, because normally they are more affected by the policy. Also, we have to consider that also in heating temps, probably in some countries that will be also more affected, because normally if you live in a rural area, the efficiency of the households normally is poorer, and also the space, or I mean the households also are larger than normally the people that will live in cities normally will live in a small city apartments. So So they have normally bigger households, less efficient, and also they need more the car. That is the reason because they will be more affected by the ETS2. And as you mentioned, it is key at a policy level to starting to identify household, not saying only the low-income household will be more affected, because that's something that when you introduce a policy, it is clear that maybe if you introduce an income threshold is important, but sometimes you need also this kind of characteristic to really focus on the people that will be more affected by this policy. And in this key, the label of rural is something that you can identify, and it is key for the implementation of and for the plans. For example, in the past, we have been discussing this a lot, especially with the energy poverty indicators, because we can do these indicators, and saying, well, in Spain or in Italy or well, I don't know, Germany, 8% of the population is energy poor. But at administration level, you don't have that label in your house. You don't have a label in the front of your door that says you are energy poor, so the government can pay you with this money to compensate you because you are energy poor. So for the government, normally it's quite difficult to identify exactly which households are vulnerable in terms of energy. And this approach of looking at the specific characteristics of the people that will be more affected by the policy that are beyond the income, it is essential, especially to design correctly the policy. So in these cases, as you mentioned, for example, you say, well, with the Social Climate Fund, we will promote public transport. That's great. And probably for a poor household that lives in an urban area in Rome, that's great. But for all those households that lives in rural areas, that maybe they are not like in the first income group, but they are in the second, and they are also vulnerable, you will not be introducing the correct policy that you want to introduce to compensate them. You see, so that's because we're starting to think that is more and more essential, not only what is happening at a vertical level when we talk about distributional implication, if not, which are the specific socioeconomic characteristics of the households, even beyond income, to design the correct policies that you want to introduce to compensate them. Even in fact, in Spain lately, we are preparing like doing some clusters analysis to identify that, no? To say once we have identified which households are energy poor in Spain, try to see through clustering, which are the specific characteristics that they have, in case if governments want to introduce some policies that go to that household, and not like to the D1 or the just an income threshold. That maybe you are covering poor people, but not a specific energy vulnerable household.
Makes sense. Yeah, that's very, very insightful. Yeah, we hope you can produce this and that the government can actually use it. And then in terms of the next research steps, extending beyond this analysis, what are sort of the next things that you're looking to incorporate or to sort of expand based on this current analysis?
For us, in this case of analysis, probably we're starting to focus more on the Spanish case. Also because for us working at a European level also is important, but as a research center in Spain also, it is starting to be quite important also what happened with the policies in Spain. And also we have to think that next year in 2025, well, in 2 weeks, next year, the governments in June, they have to provide the proposal of the social climate plans. The social climate plans basically is the plans where the government say to the European Commission, hey, with this money that there will be available in the social climate fund, I want to do this, and that. So now we are moving the direction, trying to help the Spanish government if that's the case, or at least to move that in our case in that direction to say, well, which is the specific policies that you can introduce with the social climate plan and with the social climate fund, and what will be the impact at the household level. So for us, the next direction, it will be that. And of course, this is a draft. these things that I present here is like well, it's not like a first draft, but it's not published yet. So our idea is also try to publish this analysis. That will be also the other part that we will be working in the next month related with this analysis.
No, it sounds like very, very important work. And no, thank you very much for your presentation today. We have all learned a lot. And since I don't see any questions in the chat, I don't know if anybody has anything else to say, but I think we can let everybody go off early and
that's because everything was super clear.
It was, yeah, that's exactly why, but it was.
I don't think so.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Xaquin. And we'll see you around and have happy holidays.
You too. Happy holidays to all. If you are still there.
Yes, yes, they're starting to. Okay, ciao.